Thank you for tuning in. We trust you will feel encouraged, uplifted, and inspired to build God's kingdom with us. Enjoy the message.
For us as well. All right, let's go to James chapter 5, and I'm going to read just a couple of verses there. Now remember, we're going through the book of James, and none of these sermons are particularly chosen for somebody or because some are guilty, but I think when we dig into the word like this and we start reading it, I find your God speaks to me because this is His word. And a number of times I had to underline things again and just say, Lord, help me to live this for your glory and your honor, because it's easy to slip. I know something, I do something, and it's easy next week to forget something, that same something. So I want to encourage you. So James chapter 5 verse 7. Be patient then, brothers, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, and how patient he is for the autumn and spring rains. You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Do not grumble against each other, or you'll be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we consider blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord's finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Above all, my brothers, do not swear, not by heaven, nor by earth, nor anything else. Let your yes be your yes, and your no be your no, or you will be condemned. So, again, as I look at this passage here, chapter 5, verse 1 to 6 was quite a tough one last week when it comes to our finances and greed and all of that stuff. And we go into the next couple of verses here, and it seems like the tone is sort of a little bit softer, but he's still speaking quite straight to us. And if you read this passage, there's a number of things crammed up in these few verses, and I could probably preach 5 or 6 sermons from these couple of verses. He speaks about the second coming. He speaks about standing firm until then. He speaks about being patient with one another. He speaks about not grumbling against one another. He encourages believers to be patient and to persevere in the midst of suffering. And then he says, keep your word. Let your yes be your no, your yes and your no be your no. So cancel that one out. Re-listen. Your yes be your yes and your no be your no. So, there's a number of things we can touch on this morning. So I picked one not because I specifically believe all of us are guilty, but I believe it's something in the church that needs to be addressed. All right. So I want to concentrate on the verse here, verse 9, that says, do not grumble against each other, brothers, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Now, normally when somebody says there's somebody at the door, it's imminent. Somebody's going to come in. So when he says the judge is at the door, and I'm not concentrating on that, but he says, if you grumble against one another, you're going to be judged. And the judge, he's standing, he's right there. He's right there. All right, so let's look at some of the stuff that comes from the verse. Do not grumble against each other, or you will be judged. Now, the Greek word for grumble, which can also be translated as groaning, is stenazo. Now, stenazo basically simply means to groan. So what happens is when I groan, it's normally something that happens inside of me. There's a feeling, an emotion building inside of me, and then I keep it there, and it develops internally. And if I don't have the biblical means or the biblical way or the character to do it properly, it explodes when the pressure is on. So groaning develops in explosions. All right? And some of us do it better than others, but some of us just explode. Now my wife was in Durban visiting her sister, so I brought some lunch with. All right? So yeah. So let me just balance it carefully there. How many of you know what this is, man? It's when you fish, you catch fish, you put the mealies in there, and you really make a very, very nice bait. But it's a pressure cooker, all right? A pressure cooker. Now, I will never win MasterChef. And I'm okay with that. I'm really, really okay with that. I accepted about 35 years ago that Carol will be the cook and the chef in our home, and I will conquer the world, that kind of stuff, So this is a pressure cooker. Now, a pressure cooker has got a couple of things. This is a ring that helps to seal it, and then it's got a little thingamajig at the top here that you set and it releases pressure apparently. And my wife reckons that what you put in here, and then you put the lid on, there we go, and you put your food in, says, my wife reckons that this is just as good as a potjie, that I stand 6 or 7 hours over to prepare. And she reckons what you do in that potjie, I do within an hour in this thing, a pressure cooker. So what happens is you put your meat in there or your veggies in there, and everything apparently has different times to cook, and everything heats really, really, really hot up inside of there, and over 100 degrees, and the steam doesn't escape. The steam stays in there, but the pressure escaped. Am I still okay with that? Does it sound like I know what I'm talking about? Okay. So the steam stays in there, and the steam actually goes into your meat or whatever, but it doesn't boil it. Otherwise, you could use a pot. So this is the beauty of this thing, apparently. And I'm not selling anything. I haven't got 10 in my car, so chill. But so the food is really, really soft. Okay, and so I know people are getting married. Maybe they would like one afterwards as well, but a new one. They were not going to like my old one. So now what happens is when the food is when the pressure is really, really, really high in here, then there's a little thingamajig here, a valve, and it starts whistling. And man, you can't wait because you know what is happening in here is good. It's going to taste really, really good. Okay, now let me ask the question. How many of you have, as a child, you've put a condensed milk tin inside here? Let's confess. You did. How many of you have put a tin in here and you didn't prick a little hole in your tin? How many of you did? What happened? Poof! And then you are in a state, because first of all, you stole the condensed milk, it's your mom's, you stole it. Secondly, she's coming home. Now you've got to clean not only the pot, the stove, but also the ceiling, because it flies. It is an amazing sound, and no, it's not. It just explodes. Okay, so you know what James tells us? That some of us are just like that pressure pot. When something starts boiling inside of me, there's a whistling that goes off. But James doesn't say it's a nice whistle. He says it's a groaning. It's a grumbling. And he tells us that doing that is awful. It is terrible. In fact, he says that the judge is standing at the door, and when believers are grumbling, that he is ready to judge us. It is a serious thing according to the Word of God, according to James. You see, we have challenges. We go through challenges in our life. And it is true that the pressure builds up. And it's okay because pressure must build up. But there is a biblical and correct way to release pressure. And I know when this thing is so hot and so on, that the women go and they just turn this thing a little bit, and the pressure is released, and it's okay. Now you can open the lid. And in fact, you can hardly open the lid if you haven't released the pressure here. You see, and that's how it works a little bit when it comes to stuff building up in our lives as well. You see, letting off steam is not really a bad thing if I can do it the way that God tells me to do. But most of us don't do it right. Don't look at me so super spiritually. Most of us don't do it right. And James refers to that as grumbling. You see, James is aware that when Christians are under pressure, they start to quarrel. Grumble, groan, quarrel. Same kind of thing. All right? So we start grumbling, and then what we do is, instead of directing our grumbling towards the right person, which is probably complaining rather than grumbling, instead of going and addressing the issue correctly, we actually grumble towards one another. And often the first people to suffer around us are the people closest to us and the people in our church. Christians grumble a lot. And we battle to know how to, or have the guts to handle our differences properly. And so we do it in ways, and I'll go and I'll tell you how we do it a little bit later. But you know, and we have a method of doing it, which in the world they call divide and conquer. Have you heard of that before? Divide and conquer. Hitler uses it, politicians use it, and even church people use it as well. And so what divide and conquer is basically this, is that I go to Carl. And I say, Carl, In our life group or in our church or in our company, there's a guy called James. Now, James, I know that James is trying to rise up. I know that he's trying to rise up and he's really doing well. But I've got the position that he wants. And I'm going to Carl and I talk to Carl about James and I divide the two of them. I divide their loyalties towards one another. Oh, they do it so well over times of election. I mean, the way to do it is to break your opponent down. That's how you win elections, to tell how bad it is. And you divide people. And I'm telling Carl how bad James is. But I also go to James and I tell James how bad Carl is. So now they are not loyal to one another. I've created mistrust between the two of them. And they've become loyal towards me. Because, and they sit with me. And they haven't got the guts to face one another. And even if they do, they'll probably find out that I'm a liar. So I've got to keep this tension between them by speaking bad about them to one another and not allow them to get together as well. That's what politicians do. And it's bad. And Hitler basically said these words. He says, our strategy is to destroy the enemy from within, to conquer him through himself. So any company, any family, if you allow grumbling, if you allow people to grumble against one another, you create this us versus them kind of attitude and feeling among one another. And that's how they conquered Europe in those days. It's created in a country the feeling of us versus you. My friends, it happens in your company on a daily basis. It sometimes happens in your home, in my home. It definitely also happens in the church as well. I've been a leader in church for 45 years, and I've been in full-time ministry in 2 years' time. It will be my 40th year in ministry. And let me tell you, one of the things that has hurt me as a pastor the most, and I'll play open cards with you, is this kind of grumbling. It's people who don't have the guts to come to you and say, Roelof, I disagree with you. Can we sit and have a chat about it? But as they go to this one and that one and this one. And you know what happens? In 6 months to a year time, they've all left the church, and I know exactly why. And I've asked the Lord so often in my life, I said, Lord, help me to do this. Help me to listen when people come to me and give me advice or differ with me. Help me to take what is right and help me to become absolutely dumb and numb to the stuff that is not right. And it's kept me sane. And church can be much better than this. And I believe church can be a much more wonderful place if grumbling is just something that we remove from the scenario. And if grumbling, we can take it as serious as the Bible takes it. When God says, if you grumble against a brother, you will be judged. Ooh, I find myself often saying, Lord, help me not to grumble. Help me not, help put a guard in front of my mouth. Help me to deal with my thoughts about people so that I don't become like this. One of the greatest things that Satan does to advance his purposes is cause division inside the church. And when division is there, it starts with, he starts putting us against one another. We start complaining, murmuring, fighting, bickering, grumbling against one another. And again, let me bring it back to church leadership. Let me tell you, it's a very difficult thing to do in church because you're always the object of the grumbling. You can do as well as you want as a worship leader, and always somebody will grumble and find something out or send you an email or do this and so on. And then if it just stops with complaining, it's okay. But grumbling is when I start going to one another and I create division and I create an atmosphere. And now we're at loggerheads. And this is what James is saying in chapter 4, verse 11. It speaks about slander, and he really criticizes slander. But now he says there is something that is just as terrible, and that is this attitude of grumbling, talking about one another. And you know what? It's like a bee or a mosquito grumbling. My wife has got a gift to find a mosquito 100 miles before it even hits my house. She hears it. And then it's blankets fly and hands go and lights go on and doom comes out. And I wake up as the doom goes all over my face and all over my feet and all over the place. Grumbling is a little bit like this. You think you can hide it, but it's like a buzzing of a mosquito. People hear the grumblers go through us. I'll come back to that in a moment. Some shocking scriptures in the Bible about grumbling. 1 Corinthians 10:10. The writer here, Paul, refers here to the Israelites grumbling, and I'll coming back to Numbers chapter 14 a bit later as well. He comes and he speaks to the church in Corinth, and he points a finger to the Israelites in the desert, and he says, now listen, and do not grumble as some of them did and were killed by the destroying angel. Scary, isn't it? Tough, isn't it? Grumbling is not something we just overlook. Paul writes to the Corinthians church, he says, don't do that, because when the Israelites did it, in Numbers 14, I'll get to that in a moment, the destroying angel destroyed them. God takes grumbling very seriously. In fact, in Proverbs 6 verse 6 to 19, and I'm going to only put 19 on the board, it says, 6 things the Lord hates, yet 7 are an abomination to him. A proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that are swift on running evil. And now verse 19, and false witness who speaks lies, and one who sows discord among the brethren. Just leave that up for a little bit and look at that verse, my dear friends. A false witness, that's normally what discord is. That's normally what grumbling is. It is a false witness that travels like a cancer through a family, through a company, through a church, and it just destroys. It just destroys what comes its way. And you know what God says about that? One who grumbles, one who sows discord, he says, I hate it. I hate it, God says. There are a few things in the Bible that God actually says, I hate this. One is divorce, and there's a few others. And this is one thing, one that causes discord among the brethren. God says he hates it. Numbers, let me read it quickly, where it actually happens. Numbers 14, verse 1 to 3, it says, so all of the congregation lifted up their voices, and the people wept at night, and the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, if only we died in the land of Egypt, if only we died in the wilderness, why has the Lord brought us into this land to fall by the sword, so that our wives and children should become victims? Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt? In other words, they're saying, and it's their fault because they messed up. That's why they're in the wilderness. If they were obedient, they would have been there in 3 weeks. And they spent 40 years in the desert. And now they're grumbling and complaining against God. And not only against God, but they take it out on its leaders. Take it out on its leaders. And then, as I read in 1 Corinthians 10:10, a destroying angel visit them, because God gets so upset when you and I, as believers, give in to become grumblers. Grumblers. Grumbling displeases God. Sadly, many Christians, my dear friend, listen to us. Listen to us when we talk. Listen to us when we meet in small groups. Listen to us when we have brides. Many of us as Christians are murmurous and complainers. We complain about everything. We complain about the country. We complain about people in my house. People that I work with, our job, we murmur and we complain and we see nothing good in anything, and it looks like, when they look at our faces, it looks like we've been dipped into sour prune juice or something like that. Everything is always just so, and we grumble and murmur and complain. We cannot see anything good in anything. We're miserable. And yet we're supposed to be so different because we're filled with the Holy Spirit. We see a much bigger picture, but we don't. And we're murmurous. And to murmur means to grumble or to whine. Grumble or whine. Have you ever called your kid, don't whine like that? Don't grumble like that? Maybe we should look at one another when we hear a murmurer or a grumbler among us and slap him and say, don't be like a child. You're like a baby now. You're murmuring, you're grumbling, you're whining. There are a couple of incidents in the Bible where people complain. Now, complaining is not always a bad thing. And here the Grecian woman in the church in the book of Acts, and chapter 6, verse 1 to 5, they complained because they were not looked after so well. And so the church neglected them in their daily administration. So they complained, but it wasn't murmuring. So what they did is they spoke to the right people, and the thing was put into, systems was put into place. Deacons were chosen to look after those things. And let me tell you something, a complaint directed to the right person often brings about a change, a positive change. It could. So if I can direct my complaint positively and constructive way to my church, to my job, to my local supermarket, to my husband or whatever that is, and I raise my complaint, I could actually bring about a change by doing it with the right attitude. But now, what if they don't correct it? What if they don't do what I want them to do? Or suggest that they want us to? That's when murmuring comes in. Now I start going, and I'm like this mosquito, this bee that goes around church, and I create disunity, and I create anger, and I actually tell people things they never knew about the pastor or his wife, or the deacon, or the elders, or the drummer, or something, and they would never have known it if I didn't tell them. You see, there are other examples in the New Testament where groaning definitely took place. In Matthew chapter 20, verse 1 to 16, the parable of the workers in the vineyard there. All right, here's laborers. The one arrives at 8 o'clock and he is promised 50 rand. The one arrives at 12 o'clock, he's promised 50 rand. The one arrives at 3 o'clock, he's promised 50 rand. And now they're complaining, well, I've been here at 9 o'clock and I should be really getting $100 when they get 50. And the owner of the land says, hey, listen, I'm the boss. That's Roelof's translation. What I pay who I want to pay, what I want to pay. So you just get on and do your job. Stop complaining. But there are other dudes in the Bible, the scribes and the Pharisees, in Luke chapter 5, 29 to 32, as they go around, and they were so upset with the disciples who drank and who ate with publicans and sinners. And they were so, they actually picked on Jesus as well and called the disciples and Jesus drunkards and so on because they were mixing with the unbelievers, with people who really needed Jesus. You see, these scribes and Pharisees were not particularly concerned about these people and their need for Christ. What they were really concerned about is their own personal agendas and their own honor and their rules and regulations. Another incident quickly, where Jews murmured in John chapter 6, verse 41, where they murmured against Jesus when Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Now here they are going around murmuring. Instead of investigating what he meant and what the truth of it all is they murmured, the Bible says. So if we summarize these things that I've just said, these couple of scriptures there, you'll realize that murmuring took place the moment these people disagreed with what Jesus thought they should be doing or wanted them to do. So they murmured. Is it true? Can I ask you a question? You don't have to answer me verbally. But is it true that none of us really like murmurers? It's not nice to be around murmurers, hey? Now let me tell you, it also doesn't look so good on you. Because a lot of times, I identify murmurers, but I fail to identify them myself. Don't look at me religiously. A lot of us sickle with us. Oh, that's a complainer. That's a murmurer. And the way even I say it, if I just had to, so are you, Roelof. Fix it. Fix it. You see, we see this ugly quality of murmuring and ugliness in other people. But when we look at ourselves, we actually see, hey, I'm wearing the T-shirt as well. I've got to stop murmuring. The sad thing is that a person who murmurs, normally, like I said, they don't believe that they're actually doing, but they can identify it in you. And it's tough. Some people think, well, murmuring is, I can just gently do it. I can gently tell you, that James, James is this and that and so on. If I just gently do it with the love of Jesus, then it's going to be okay. It's sin. It's sin. And other people just want to do it aggressively. Just like that, A lot of Christians have toned it down. In the beginning, as a new believer, you come and your murmuring is quite loud and aggressive. And you do that at the shop when you're unhappy with the product that they sell you. And you become totally unchristian, And they say, oh, that guy just came from church, That's nice. And pleased to meet you as well, But now we've learned to just tone it down a little bit. So my murmuring is now with the love of Jesus. It's sin. It is sin. The Bible calls it sin. Make no mistake. Murmuring is sin. Right? Let's go to a couple of scriptures here quickly. Philippians chapter 2, verse 14 to 15. Do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless. Children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as the lights in the world. What kind of light are we shining when we are murmuring and complaining about people, my boss, and other stuff all the time because I'm not getting my way? 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 9. Be hospitable to one another without grumbling. In other words, have your heart open towards people without grumbling. Oh, honey, I just invited 5 people for supper. Who's going to cook and who's going to clean up afterwards? You always leave me with all the work and you just mix with the people. My wife doesn't talk like that, so it's not Carol, okay? All right. But she will probably say that I don't clean up afterwards, so she might be right there. Okay. Be hospitable. Hospitable, basically, it's not just cooking food. It means let your heart be open to people without grumbling. I've already read 1 Corinthians 10:10, but let me just go there again. It says, and do not grumble. Man, the angel of death visited them and destroyed them. In other words, grumblers perish. It's tough, this, eh? It's hard. Being a Christian is swimming upstream. It is definitely swimming upstream. You've got to go against the trends here. So murmuring, I think, is a common sign among believers and in church. And I think I'm right when I say that. You see, those of us who never think of committing adultery or murder are guilty of this sin, murmuring. And Jesus says the judge is standing at the door when you murmur. So some of us have these high morals and we live these biblical doctrines and we sound biblical doctrines in it. And we give and we're amazing givers. But we destroy all these good things because of our whining. Now, let me give you 2 quick reasons why we do murmur. Number one, and I've already touched on it, because I'm discontented. Discontentment breeds murmuring in me. And you know what? There's so many verses, and I'm going to mention that. They'll be with my notes on the website tomorrow. But it's 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 7 and 8. It says, be content in everything. That means in Hebrews 13:5 with what you have. That means in Philippians chapter 4 verse 11 with your lot. That means in Luke chapter 5 verse 5 with whatever comes your way from God. Be content. The second reason why I murmur is blatantly just because I'm selfish. Philippians chapter 2 verse 4 and Romans chapter 15 verse 2. You see, selfish people want their way. And when they don't get their way, they murmur. And if they just murmur in the toilet or in their bedroom, it will be okay. But they normally murmur by spreading the news. And you know what they do is, when they do that, what they do is they're spreading it and try and create loyalty with other people and bring division in the church. So normally, if I have a problem and I murmur, I would go to somebody, I would go to Leah and say, you know what, and so I want her to agree with me, create loyalty, and then I want to create disloyalty because now somebody is the object here. Yeah, well, the Bible says, don't do it. You're going to be judged. Let us not murmur. Let's go and see what the Bible actually does say about how we should live. Is live contented. Philippians 4 verse 4, rejoice always in the Lord. 1 Timothy chapter 2 verse 1, be thankful. Let thankfulness let gratitude characterize my life. Not selfishness. Not my way. Ephesians chapter 4, 31 and 32 says, let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away from us, from you, with all malice. And be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving, just as God in Christ forgave you. My dear friends, words, listen to me, words are extremely powerful. Once you've sown those words, you cannot take them back. In fact, you can bring some healing, but you will never be able to take you back. Once you have condemned Stuart and thrown a dart in his back and told other people how bad you think he is, you will never uncreate the image that you have created. Never. Yeah, he will forgive because he has to. He says, maybe not. And I will forgive you for telling me the bad things about him, but I will always think, if you've said it, maybe you are right. I've now tainted him. There was a young girl, true story. Her name was Mary. Mary realized when she was growing up that she was different. And she had a cleft palate, and they didn't stop teasing her at school. True story, this. Non-stop. They teased her about her misshaped lip, a crooked nose, and the way she spoke with a cleft lip. And with all this teasing, Mary grew up really starting to hate herself because she was so different. And she thought, well, she was absolutely convinced at one stage in her life that no one outside of her own family could ever really love her. And then she went to Standard 5, and she entered the class, and there was a teacher, and her name was Mrs. Leonard. True story, what I'm telling you now. Mrs. Leonard had this warm smile. She had a round face, she had the shiny brown hair. She was just full of love. And most people liked Mrs. Leonard, but Mary learned to really love Mrs. Leonard. You see, I don't know if you grew up in the 1950s and 60s where they did hearing tests regularly with children, and this is what they did, is they would march us to a door over there, and then the teacher would mumble something, and you had to put your hand, who did ever that? Maybe they did it later as well. And the teacher would say something, and you had to repeat, and that child has got a hearing problem. And normally they sorted it out right here, but with a smack on the back, and I'm talking about real hearing problem. And then you would stand this way as well. And so it was Mary's turn, and this time Mary was absolutely determined that she wasn't going to be the object of another joke, because you see, she was deaf in the one ear. So she walked to the door when Mrs. Leonard said, "It's your turn, Mary." And she stood at the door, and she stood with her deaf ear towards Mrs. Leonard, and she just put her hand over the good ear like this, because she was determined she was going to hear Mrs. Leonard. You see, the questions were sort of similar and the same, because it was mostly what color is the sky outside, or what color shoes have you got. So she sort of memorized an answer already. I was ready to give an answer, but cheating a little bit. And then she heard 7 words that changed her life. And instead of hearing the whisper test, which was normal, what color shoes, Mrs. Leonard says, "Mary, I wish you were my little girl." And it changed Mary's life completely. The power of words is immense. And some of you feel it today, either because you feel strong or you feel annihilated because of words. Words are powerful.